The winter of 1888 came down on the Dakota Territories like a hammer. It was not a gentle arrival, not a slow dusting of snow that promised cozy evenings by the fire. It was a declaration of war. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs, it breathed through the smallest cracks in the chinking, and it settled deep in the bones of the people who had dared to build their lives on that vast, unforgiving prairie. The wind was its scout, a ceaseless torment that scoured the land, stripping away warmth like a thief. For the settlers in the small, isolated community of Havenwood, survival was measured in cords of wood and the ferocity of the fire in the hearth. Their cabins were built to a familiar and trusted design, the same design their fathers and grandfathers had used back east. They were sturdy boxes of felled timber, notched and stacked with calloused hands, their gaps stuffed with mud, moss, and desperate prayers. But the cold of this new land was different. It was a living entity, ancient and intelligent. It tested the walls, found the weaknesses, and poured inside. Frost didn't just paint the window panes. It grew like crystalline moss on the interior walls, inches away from the roaring stove. A man could stand close enough to the fire to feel his face burn, while his back remained rigid with cold. It was a constant, draining battle, and every year the winter won in small, cruel ways. The community struggled as one. In every cabin, the story was the same. A mountain of split oak and ash, piled high in October, would shrink to a desperate mound by January. Families huddled together under shared blankets, their breath pluming in the air of their own homes. The sound of the settlement was the ring of axes during the day and the howl of the wind at night, punctuated by the hacking coughs of children who could never seem to get warm. They were strong, resilient people, but they were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that never tired. They did what they had always done, because it was all they knew how to do. They built their walls thicker, chinked their logs more carefully, and cut more wood than the year before. And every year, it was not quite enough. The cold always found a way in. Ilara had known this cold for 3 winters. She was a widow, a quiet woman whose presence in the community was as soft and unassuming as a shadow. She had arrived with her husband Thomas, an engineer from a distant city whose mind was filled with strange ideas about stress, load, and thermal dynamics. He had seen the prairie not as a place to conquer, but as a problem to be solved. He had filled notebooks with sketches and calculations before a sudden fever took him, leaving Ilara with 2 small children and a half-finished cabin at the edge of the settlement. The community had helped her finish it, their pity a temporary balm for her grief. They saw her as a fragile thing, a woman ill-suited for the harsh realities of the frontier. They did not see the steel in her spine, forged in the quiet observation of her husband's methodical mind. Her children, Caleb and little May, were the center of her world, and they were the reason for the fear that gnawed at her. May's cough had returned with the first hard frost, a dry, rattling sound that echoed the brittleness of the frozen world outside. Caleb, older and more stoic, would shiver silently in his sleep, his small body curled into a tight knot of resistance against the cold that invaded their home. Ilara fed the stove relentlessly, her waking hours a cycle of splitting wood, stoking flames, and watching the precious heat rise directly to the rafters and vanish into the unforgiving sky. Her cabin was no better than any other. It was a sieve, and the warmth she fought so hard to create was lost almost as soon as it was born. She knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the wind, that following the old ways would not be enough to keep her children safe through this winter. One evening, with the wind shrieking like a banshee against the walls, she sat by the dwindling fire, Thomas's leather-bound notebooks open on her lap. She couldn't follow all the complex equations, but she understood the principles he had so often explained to her. He had spoken of heat not as a fleeting comfort, but as a physical presence that could be captured, stored, and managed. He had been fascinated by the earth itself, by the way the deep soil of the riverbank remained cool to the touch on the hottest summer day, and how it resisted the first frosts of autumn long after the surface had frozen solid. He called it thermal mass, a word the others in Havenwood would not have understood.
"The problem isn't the cold getting in," he had once told her, tapping a drawing of a standard cabin. "It's the heat getting out. We build wooden boxes and then try to fill them with warmth. It's like trying to carry water in a net. The structure itself must become the vessel." His finger had traced a new design, one with thick, earthen walls. But she didn't have the strength to build a new house of sod. She had to work with what she had. Her eyes fell upon a sketch in the margin, a cross-section of a roof and ceiling. He had written a single, speculative note beside it. Mass absorbs, mass holds, mass radiates. What if the reservoir for heat isn't the fire, but the house itself? And then the idea began to form. It was radical, born of desperation and the fading echo of her husband's voice. It was not about keeping the cold out. It was about holding the heat in. The greatest loss of warmth was through the roof. The hot air from the stove rose, hit the thin wooden ceiling, and was immediately stolen by the frozen abyss of the attic space above. What if that space wasn't empty? What if it was filled with something dense, something with mass? Her mind went to the riverbank, to the tons of clean, fine sand that lay just beneath the frozen topsoil. Sand. Heavy, dense, and plentiful. What if she could pack the space between her ceiling and her roof with a thick layer of river sand? The stovepipe, radiating immense heat, passed directly through that space. The sand would absorb that wasted energy, slowly becoming a vast, warm blanket weighing down upon the room, a reservoir of gentle, radiant heat that would last long after the fire had died down. The next morning, she put on her worn coat and walked to the cabin of Silas, the settlement's unofficial leader and most experienced builder. He was a large, practical man whose confidence was as solid as the foundations he laid. He was splitting wood with powerful, rhythmic swings of his axe, his breath clouding in the sharp air. She waited for him to finish, then explained her idea in a quiet, steady voice. She spoke of thermal mass, of absorbing the stovepipe's heat, of creating a reservoir. Silas stopped, leaning on his axe handle, and stared at her as if she had grown a second head. He slowly shook his head, a wry, pitying smile touching his lips. "Ilara," he said, his voice laced with the condescending patience one uses with a child. "Sand is for mortar, maybe for putting out a fire. It's not for a ceiling. Do you have any idea how much that would weigh? A foot of sand over your whole ceiling. It would be tons. Tons. It would split your joists and bring the entire roof down on your children's heads. It is the most foolish thing I have ever heard." A few other men, working nearby, had stopped to listen. A chuckle rippled through them. "Heard that, Jed? The widow aims to bury herself before the winter does," one of them called out, and the others laughed. The sound was not overtly cruel, but it was dismissive, a casual assertion of their practical wisdom against her strange, bookish fancy. They saw a grieving woman, her mind unmoored by loss, grasping at impossible notions. "I would reinforce the joists first," she said, her voice barely a whisper against their mirth. "Thomas's books show how." This only deepened their amusement. "A woman telling me about joists," Silas scoffed, though not unkindly. "Ilara, stick to your knitting. We will help you bank your cabin with snow when the time comes. We will see you have enough wood. But do not do this foolish, dangerous thing. I forbid it, for your own safety." He turned back to his work, the thud of his axe a clear and final dismissal. The other men went back to their own tasks, shaking their heads and sharing quiet jokes. From that day on, her project was known throughout Havenwood as Ilara's Folly. The name was spoken with a mixture of pity and ridicule, a cautionary tale about what happened when a person, particularly a woman, strayed from the known and trusted ways. She walked back to her cabin, the laughter still echoing in her ears, her isolation now complete. But in her mind, she saw not a ceiling collapsing, but her children sleeping soundly in a warm, quiet room. The mockery of men was nothing compared to the fear of a child's cough in the dead of winter. Her resolve did not waver. It hardened into silent, unyielding determination. The work began the very next day. Before she could haul a single bucket of sand, she had to prepare the house to bear the immense weight. She descended into the small, dusty cellar with a lantern, Thomas's notebooks laid open on a crate. His precise architectural script guided her. He had designed the cabin with stronger foundation pillars than necessary, always planning for future additions. She found the points he had marked as load-bearing and, over the course of a week, used a screwjack and thick, cured timbers to place additional support posts directly under the main ceiling beams. It was slow, arduous work, her muscles screaming in protest. But she followed his diagrams with meticulous care. Then came the attic. It was a frigid, dark space filled with the smell of old wood and dust. Here, the real labor began. She had to double the number of joists that supported the ceiling planks. Using a block and tackle her husband had left behind, she hauled seasoned beams, one by one, into the suffocating space. She learned to measure and saw with a precision that surprised even herself, her hands, once soft, becoming calloused and capable. She sistered each new joist to an old one, bolting them together, creating a dense, powerful grid of support. The men of the settlement, had they seen it, would have been shocked by the integrity of the construction. But no one came to see. They only saw her entering the house with tools and emerging hours later, covered in sawdust and exhaustion. They shook their heads, certain she was merely tinkering with some strange, pointless project inside. Only when the structure was ready did she turn her attention to the river. The banks were a quarter-mile away, a journey made longer by the uneven, frozen ground. The sand was deep, protected from the worst of the freeze by a thick blanket of snow. She would clear a patch, break through the frozen crust of the earth with a pickaxe, and then shovel the cold, heavy sand into 2 large buckets. The journey back was a torment. Each bucket weighed 50 pounds, a staggering load that strained her back and shoulders. Her path became a deep, grooved trail in the snow, a testament to her relentless, repetitive labor. Day after day she made the journey. 10 trips in the morning, a short rest to tend to the children and the fire, and then 10 more trips in the afternoon, until the light failed. The community watched her. They saw the solitary figure trudging back and forth, 2 buckets swinging at her sides. They saw the growing pile of sand beside her cabin door. Their mockery softened into a kind of bewildered pity. "The poor woman's grief has unsettled her mind," they would say to one another. "She means to bury her house in a riverbank." No one offered to help. To help would be to endorse the madness, to become complicit in the folly that they were sure would end in disaster. Her isolation was a wall she built with every bucket she carried. While Ilara toiled at her strange task, the rest of Havenwood prepared for winter in the traditional way. They spent their days felling trees, the forest echoing with the sharp crack of axes. Wagons creaked under the strain of logs being hauled back to the settlement. Great stacks of firewood grew beside every cabin, monuments to their diligence. They went over their homes with a critical eye, stuffing any new cracks with moss and fresh mud, their movements efficient and practiced. They were securing their defenses, reinforcing the familiar battle lines for the coming siege. They looked at Alara's growing pile of sand, and then at their own towering stacks of wood, and they felt a sense of pride in their sensible, hard-won security. They were doing what worked, what had always been done. They were realists, not dreamers. Inside her cabin, Alara completed the final stage of her project. She used the block and tackle to haul the sand, bucket by bucket, up into the attic. There, in the dim, freezing air, she spread it carefully and evenly across the ceiling planks, between the newly reinforced joists. She packed it down, ensuring there were no gaps, creating a solid, uniform layer a full foot deep. The last area she filled was around the stovepipe. Here, she mixed the sand with clay to create a fireproof barrier, just as Thomas's notes instructed. As she worked, she could feel the change. The house grew quieter. The constant whistling moan of the wind in the rafters was muffled, replaced by a profound and heavy silence. The very character of the space was transforming. When the last bucket was empty, she stood for a moment in the quiet, dusty dark. The work was done. Below her, a foot of dense river sand, a silent, waiting reservoir, now separated her family from the sky. The principle was simple, a law of physics her husband had revered. The roaring stove was a source of immense energy, but in a normal cabin, most of that energy, in the form of heat, was wasted. It shot up the stovepipe and radiated into the attic, where it was immediately lost to the outside world. Alara's design was a trap for that escaping energy. The heavy metal stovepipe would now heat the tons of sand surrounding it. Sand, like earth and stone, is slow to warm, but it is also slow to cool. It would absorb the heat for hours, becoming a massive, stable thermal battery. Throughout the long, cold night, long after the fire in the stove had been banked to embers, that vast, warm ceiling of sand would continue to radiate a gentle, even heat downwards into the room below. It was not a barrier against the cold. It was a bank for the warmth. A simple, elegant solution hidden in a bucket of sand. She had not built a wall. She had built a heart for her home. The first week of December, the sky turned the color of slate, and the air grew unnaturally still. The old-timers in Havenwood recognized the signs. A deep, abiding quiet fell over the settlement as people made their final preparations. Doors were barred, extra wood was brought inside, and livestock were secured in their barns. They were bracing for a storm. But no one was prepared for what came next. It did not arrive like a normal blizzard, with rising winds and a slow thickening of snow. It fell upon them like a collapsing mountain. The locals would later call it the White Death. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single hour. The wind came not as a gale, but as a solid wall of force that screamed out of the north, carrying a blinding torrent of ice and snow. It was a storm of impossible violence, a meteorological anomaly that defied all experience. The world beyond the cabin walls simply disappeared, erased by a churning, white chaos. The sound was a deafening roar, a physical pressure that made the log walls groan and shudder. It was as if the world itself was being torn apart. Inside the cabins of Havenwood, the familiar battle against the cold escalated into a desperate, losing war. The wind, armed with the fury of the Arctic, was a relentless invader. It forced its way through the tiniest imperfections in the chinking, blasting jets of fine, powdery snow into the rooms. The frost on the walls no longer crept. It leaped upwards from the floorboards, thick and fast, like a malevolent white fire. The heat from the stoves, which now had to be fed every few minutes, was beaten back, unable to establish even a small circle of comfort. Families abandoned their beds and huddled directly in front of the open hearths, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their backs freezing
while their faces were scorched by the frantic flames. In Silas's cabin, the situation was dire. As the settlement's best builder, his home was considered the most secure. But the storm treated his masterful construction with contempt. A fine dusting of snow covered the floor along the far wall, blown straight through the logs. His wife, Martha, held their youngest son, who was shivering violently, despite being wrapped in a bearskin rug. The firebox glowed cherry red, consuming seasoned oak at an astonishing rate. Silas worked grimly, feeding the beast, knowing that his woodpile, which he had thought would last until February, was shrinking at a terrifying pace. The cold was a palpable presence in the room, an aggressive, suffocating force that was stealing the very air from their lungs. He looked at his family, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering firelight, and for the first time in his life, he felt a profound and terrifying helplessness. The old ways were failing. The storm tested Ilara's creation with the same savage intensity. The wind hammered at her small cabin, and the log walls vibrated with the force of the assault. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of unimaginable fury. But inside, something was fundamentally different. The first thing was the sound. The deafening roar of the wind was muffled, transformed from a terrifying shriek into a distant, hollow moan. The heavy layer of sand in the ceiling was absorbing the vibration and the noise, creating a pocket of strange, unnerving calm. There were no drafts. The air in the room was still. Ilara kept the fire in her stove burning, but it was a low, steady fire, not a raging inferno. She fed it a single log every hour. The stovepipe glowed with a dull, consistent heat where it rose toward the ceiling. In the room, the air was not hot, but it was warm. A deep, even, and pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. There were no cold spots, no icy drafts. Caleb and May were not huddled by the fire. They were asleep in their beds on the far side of the room, breathing the slow, deep breaths of untroubled slumber. Ilara sat in her rocking chair, knitting, the only light coming from a single oil lamp and the gentle glow of the stove. The walls of her home did not radiate cold. The frost did not climb her walls. The ceiling above her, packed with tons of river sand, was doing its silent work. It had absorbed hours of heat from the stovepipe, and now it was radiating it back down, a gentle, invisible blanket of warmth that defied the raging apocalypse outside. The house was not fighting the storm. It was ignoring it. It had become its own self-sustaining ecosystem of warmth, its heart the glowing stove, its body the heated mass of sand. It worked. For 3 days and 3 nights, the White Death held Havenwood in its grip. The wind never ceased its assault, and the snow piled in mountainous drifts that buried fences and reached the eaves of the cabins. Inside the homes of the settlers, hope began to curdle into despair. The battle for warmth had become a frantic, minute-to-minute struggle. Woodpiles dwindled to nothing. Men resorted to burning furniture, chairs, chests, even the planks from their beds, to keep the fires from dying completely. The interior temperatures of the cabins hovered just above freezing. Water froze in buckets only a few feet from the hearth. The cold was relentless, seeping into everything, draining the strength and resolve of the people. It was no longer a matter of comfort, but of survival. In Silas's home, the last of the firewood was gone. He had already broken up a wooden crate and 2 chairs. His son's cough had grown worse, a wet, rattling sound that tore at his heart with every gasp. Martha sat with the boy, her face a mask of fear, trying to warm him with the fading heat of her own body. The fire was a pathetic collection of embers, offering little more than a flicker of light against the oppressive, encroaching cold. The temperature in the room was now below freezing. Silas looked at the sturdy cradle he had built for his son,
his axe resting nearby. He knew it would have to be the next thing to burn. He felt a profound sense of failure, a crushing weight of shame. He, the master builder, the man who provided for and protected his family, had been defeated. His knowledge, his traditions, his strength, all had proven inadequate. It was Martha who finally spoke the name that had been lingering in the back of his mind. "Silas," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The widow, Ilara." He looked at her, confused. "Her cabin is at the edge of the woods," she continued. "The wind is worse there. If she runs out of wood, her children—" Her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. In their own desperate struggle, they had forgotten the woman they had all dismissed as a fool. A sudden, terrible image filled Silas's mind. Ilara and her 2 small children, frozen in their home. The roof collapsed under the weight of her folly. His own failure was one thing, but to know that he had stood by and let her pursue a dangerous path, mocking her instead of helping her, was an unbearable thought. He had to go. He had to see. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he possessed and stepped out into the storm. The force of the wind knocked him back against the doorframe. The air was so cold, it felt like breathing shards of glass. He could see nothing but a swirling white vortex. He fought his way through the chest-deep snow, his body a bulwark against the hurricane-force gusts, navigating by pure instinct. The short distance to Ilara's cabin felt like a journey of miles. He finally stumbled against her door, his beard and eyebrows caked in ice, his lungs burning. He half expected to find the cabin dark and silent, its roof caved in. He pounded on the door with a frozen fist, shouting her name against the roar of the wind. The door opened. Silas fell forward, bracing himself against the frame, and was met not by a blast of icy air, but by a gentle, enveloping wave of calm, steady warmth. It was so unexpected that for a moment he thought his frozen mind was deceiving him. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight. He saw Ilara, her expression calm, a knitting needle in her hand. On the floor, her son Caleb was quietly playing with a set of carved wooden soldiers. In the corner bed, her daughter May was sleeping peacefully, her breathing even and clear. There was no sign of shivering, no huddling by the fire. The stove itself was not roaring. It was burning with a low, serene orange glow, consuming a single log. The room was not hot, but it was profoundly and comfortably warm. Silas stared, speechless. He looked from the sleeping child to the quietly playing boy, to the calm woman in her rocking chair. He looked at the walls, free of frost. He looked up at the ceiling, which seemed to be the source of this impossible peace. He could not comprehend it. His own home, built with all the skill and tradition he possessed, was an icebox where his family was on the verge of freezing to death. This woman's home, the subject of so much ridicule, was an oasis of warmth in the heart of the Arctic tempest. He felt the foundations of his world, of everything he thought he knew, crumble beneath him. Ilara did not gloat. There was no hint of triumph in her eyes, only a quiet compassion. She saw the ice on his beard, the desperation in his gaze, and the exhaustion that radiated from him. "Come in, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "You look frozen." She helped him inside, closing the door against the howling storm, and the world of chaos was once again shut out, replaced by the deep, resonant silence of her home. She ladled a bowl of hot broth from a pot simmering on the stove and handed it to him. He took it with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into his frozen fingers. He was a proud man, a man respected by the entire community, but in that moment he felt like a foolish child. He was wrong, utterly, completely, and dangerously wrong. He took a sip of the broth and finally found his voice, a choked whisper. "How?" She did not offer a long, complicated explanation. She simply gestured with her head towards the ceiling. "The sand," she said. "It holds the heat." The simplicity of the statement, the quiet confidence with which she said it, struck him more forcefully than any boast could have. It was a fact, a law of nature she had understood, and he had dismissed. He had laughed at her. He had called her a fool. And her foolishness was now keeping her children safe and warm, while his wisdom had brought his own family to the brink of disaster. The warmth of the cabin was more than physical. It was the warmth of a superior idea, a better way, and he was humbled to his very core. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day. The wind died down to a whisper, and a pale, watery sun revealed a world transformed, buried under a monolithic blanket of white. The silence was as shocking as the noise had been. From the cabins of Havenwood, figures emerged, haggard and worn, their faces etched with the strain of the ordeal. The first task was to check on one another. The news spread quickly, a current of disbelief and rumor. Silas, the strongest among them, had nearly frozen. His family was safe, but they had burned half their furniture to survive. Others had fared worse. But the most incredible story was the one Silas himself began to tell, his voice heavy with a newfound humility. He spoke of the widow's cabin. He told them about the warmth, not a scorching, temporary heat from a desperate fire, but a deep, abiding warmth that filled the entire room. He described the sleeping children, the quiet stove, the profound calm inside Ilara's home, while the world outside was tearing itself apart. At first, they didn't believe him. They thought the cold had affected his mind. So he led a small group of the settlement's most respected men, the very same men who had laughed at her idea, on a walk to her cabin. They trudged through the massive drifts, their skepticism a palpable force. Ilara saw them coming and opened her door before they knocked. One by one, they stepped inside, their expressions shifting from disbelief to astonishment to awe. They entered from a world of brutal, biting cold into a sanctuary of peaceful warmth. They touched the walls, expecting to feel the familiar chill of the logs, but found them neutral, almost warm to the touch. They looked up at the ceiling, trying to understand how this simple, unseen thing could make such a profound difference. They saw her small, neat pile of firewood, barely diminished from what it was before the storm. They compared it to their own empty woodsheds and the charred remains of their chairs and tables. The evidence was irrefutable. Ilara's folly was a triumph of staggering genius. The laughter that had once defined their opinion of her was replaced by a deep, respectful silence. Later that day, after the others had left, Silas returned to Ilara's cabin alone. He was not the proud, confident leader they had known. He was humbled, his arrogance stripped away by the brutal honesty of the storm. He held a small, leather-bound notebook and a piece of charcoal in his hand. He did not ask for forgiveness for his mockery, nor did he offer excuses. His posture was that of a student before a master. He stood at her door and spoke the two words that signified the complete surrender of his pride. "Teach me." Ilara invited him in. She did not remind him of his earlier dismissal or take any satisfaction in his reversal. Her victory was not over him, but over the cold. She simply nodded and cleared the small table. She brought out her husband's notebooks, the pages filled with diagrams and calculations, and spread them out before him. For hours, she explained the principles Thomas had taught her. She spoke of reinforcing the joists, of distributing the weight evenly across the foundation, of the critical importance of sealing the space to prevent heat loss. She explained thermal mass not as a strange theory, but as a practical tool. "The sand is like a stone you put in the fire," she said simply. "It soaks up the heat when the fire is high, and it gives it back when the fire is low. Our house becomes the hearthstone." Silas listened, his full attention on her words.
He, who had built dozens of structures, realized he had only ever constructed shells. He had never understood the dynamics of warmth, only the brute force of fire. He asked questions, sharp and intelligent, his builder's mind quickly grasping the mechanical concepts. He copied her husband's diagrams into his own notebook, his rough, calloused hands carefully recreating the precise lines. He was not just learning a new technique. He was undergoing a fundamental shift in his understanding of the world.
He had always believed survival was about fighting the winter. Elara had shown him it was about working with the laws of nature. By the time he left her cabin that evening, the knowledge had been transferred. The quiet innovator had freely given her wisdom to the man who had once been her most vocal critic. When the Great Thaw of 1889 arrived, melting the colossal snowdrifts and revealing the green shoots of a resilient prairie, a new sound filled the air in Havenwood. Alongside the familiar ring of axes and the rasp of saws, there was the rhythmic scrape of shovels against the wet sand of the riverbank. The rebuilding began not with walls, but with ceilings. Led by Silas, the men of the settlement worked as one, with a shared purpose they had never known before. He was a changed man, patient and methodical, referring constantly to the notes he had taken from Elara. He tolerated no shortcuts. They worked cabin by cabin, starting with the families who had the youngest children. They reinforced the attics, sistering new joists to the old, just as Elara had done. They built strong, precisely measured support structures that would easily bear the immense load to come. Then, they formed long lines from the river to the settlement, passing heavy buckets of sand from one man to the next. It was a communal effort, a ritual of shared labor and shared humility. They were undoing the mistakes of the past, unlearning the flawed traditions of their fathers. The women, who had once shared pitying glances about Elara's folly, now brought food and water to the men, their faces filled with a quiet gratitude. The landscape of their community was physically and spiritually changing. By the time the first snows of the next winter fell, every single cabin in Havenwood had a sand-packed ceiling. The towering woodpiles of previous years were noticeably smaller, yet no one felt the familiar anxiety. When the cold descended, it was met not with a frantic, roaring fire, but with a low, steady one. A deep, quiet warmth filled their homes. The nights were peaceful. The children slept soundly, their coughs gone. The settlers had discovered a new kind of peace, a security they had never imagined possible. They had learned to bank their heat as they banked their fires, and in doing so, they had finally broken the tyranny of the cold. The story of Havenwood's warm winter traveled. A fur trapper, forced to stay in the settlement for a week during a cold snap, was astonished by the comfort of the cabins. He had never experienced anything like it. He carried the tale with him to the next outpost, describing the sand roofs that held the heat of a small fire all through the night. A government surveyor, mapping the territory, spent a night in Silas's home, and spent the next day sketching the design and taking notes. The idea spread, not through books or official decrees, but as all-powerful, practical wisdom does. From person to person, a story told around a campfire, a solution shared between neighbors. It became known in other settlements as the Havenwood Ceiling, or, more simply, the Widow's Way. It was a quiet revolution of common sense, a legacy of warmth that grew from a single, desperate idea. Elara never sought recognition. She remained a quiet member of the community, her life defined by the simple rhythms of raising her children and tending her home. Her triumph was not in being proven right, but in the silence of a winter night, a silence no longer broken by the sound of a shivering child. She had listened to a different kind of wisdom, one found not in loud tradition, but in quiet observation, in the forgotten notes of a brilliant man, and in the unyielding determination of a mother's love.
The people of Havenwood learned a lesson that winter that was far more important than a new building technique. They learned that the most valuable wisdom is often found in the quietest voices, and that true strength lies not in clinging to the old ways, but in having the humility to embrace a better one. The winter still came down on the territories like a hammer, but now they were no longer the anvil. They were the hearth, warm and enduring.